Chapter 1. A Night of Despair at Almack's. The illustrious assembly rooms of Almack's, widely revered as the inviolable sanctuary of London's high society, blazed beneath the magnificent radiance of 8 colossal crystal chandeliers. The warm, flickering candlelight reflected upon the polished oak floors, gleaming with the finest beeswax imported from the continent, crafting an atmosphere of resplendent grandeur that was simultaneously laced with political machinations and silent, ruthless judgment. The melodious strains of a waltz, performed by a brilliant 15-piece orchestral ensemble, melded seamlessly with the soft rustling of expensive taffeta gowns and the hushed, gossiping whispers concealed behind luxurious feathered fans. Within these hallowed walls gathered the most formidable and influential figures of the ton, the earls, viscounts, and parliamentarians who held the political destiny of the entire realm in their manicured hands. For any young aristocratic lady of the season, receiving a gold-embossed voucher from the formidable patronesses of Almack's was an unparalleled honor. It was the singular passport required to cross the threshold into the most prestigious matrimonial alliances of the London season. A mere nod of approval within this room could elevate an entire lineage, while a single, subtle frown had the power to ruin a life beyond repair. Lady Eleanor Vance stood pressed against an intricately carved marble pillar in the shadowed corner of the grand hall, her hands, encased in pristine white silk gloves, trembling slightly from the invisible tension crushing her chest. She was adorned in a delicate sky-blue silk evening gown that, while eschewing ostentatious frills, exuded an aura of rare, effortless elegance. Her golden hair was swept up in an immaculate, sophisticated chignon, and resting against her collarbone was a simple yet exquisitely refined strand of pearls, the solitary, precious heirloom bequeathed to her by her late mother. Eleanor was the legitimate eldest daughter of the distinguished Earl of Vance. However, from the very day her father remarried the Dowager Lady Vance, a woman notorious for her insatiable greed, profound cunning, and notorious cruelty, Eleanor's existence had devolved into a suffocating nightmare within the walls of her own ancestral home. Through her demure demeanor, gentle grace, impeccable etiquette, and a rare, profound intellect, Eleanor had managed to capture the singular attention of Viscount Linfield, a dashing, wealthy, and highly sought-after nobleman who was widely considered the premier catch of the social season. The marriage snezzlement between their two houses had already been meticulously drafted by the finest solicitors, clearly delineating her substantial dowry and inheritance, and awaited only the formal signatures at the registry. Yet, as her radiant success acted as a jagged thorn thrust directly into the fiercely jealous hearts of her stepmother and her utterly unremarkable half-sister, Isabella, they vehemently refused to accept the prospect of the first wife's daughter entering high society with an elevated status and a massive dowry that they believed rightfully belonged to Isabella. Just as the buoyant strains of the orchestra swelled into the final movement of the waltz, a sharp, deafening crash shattered the elegant ambiance of the assembly room. Lady Vance strode forcefully into the very center of the polished dance floor, her heavily powdered and rouged face contorted into an expression of theatrical, manufactured outrage. With a violent motion, she hurled a thick bundle of love letters, bound tightly in deep red velvet ribbon, onto the gleaming oak floor, simultaneously unleashing a piercing shriek that commanded the immediate cessation of the music. Hundreds of eyes instantly gravitated toward her, burning with the morbid curiosity, eagerness, and malicious scrutiny so characteristic of London's aristocratic elite. What an absolute, unmitigated disgrace. A stain that can never be washed from the noble name of Vance. I have tried to hide it. I have attempted to shield this filth with a mother's boundless compassion, but her depravity and wantonness have finally exceeded the limits of my endurance. Lady Vance shrieked, her trembling finger pointing directly at Eleanor, who stood frozen, paralyzed by shock against the marble pillar. Look at this, all of you. Gaze upon these sordid love letters, filled with the most vulgar clandestine declarations that the Earl of Vance's own flesh and blood has been sending to a lowly, wretched stable boy employed at our country estate. And as if that were not enough, she had the sheer audacity to pick the locks of my chambers and steal the ancestral emerald parure to fund her despicable lover's debaucheries. How can a creature harboring noble blood possess a nature so thieving, so base, and so utterly vile? How can she ever be deemed worthy of setting foot within the sacred halls of Almack's? She is a profound insult to the entirety of the ton. A cacophony of hushed, scandalous whispers erupted like a disturbed hornet's nest, echoing off the high ceilings of the cavernous hall. Noblewomen hastily snapped open their silk fans to shield their mouths, unleashing venomous critiques and casting glares of unadulterated disgust squarely in Eleanor's direction. The atmosphere, thick with the scent of expensive perfumes, suddenly became suffocating, heavy with the weight of immediate, ruthless condemnation. Not a single soul demanded to verify the handwriting. Not one person called for the stable boy to testify. They simply reveled in the brutal dismantling of a young woman's honor at the absolute zenith of her glory. Eleanor's face went chalk white, the color completely draining from her cheeks. Her entire body shook violently as her eyes widened in profound, absolute horror at her stepmother's absurd, maliciously orchestrated lies. She took a faltering step forward, desperately fighting to keep her voice from shattering under the crushing weight of the crowd's hostility. "My lady, what are you saying? Those are absolute, blatant falsehoods fabricated by your own hand. I have never written a single letter to any servant, nor have I ever set foot near the stables. Please, father, I beg of you, step forward and speak a word of truth for me. You know full well I am incapable of such depravity." But the Earl of Vance, a cowardly, spineless man entirely subjugated by Lady Vance's beauty and venomous manipulation, merely shrank back into the crowd. He turned his face away, deliberately avoiding the desperate, tear-filled gaze of his own flesh and blood. He dared not step out to defend her before the entirety of London's elite, terrified that this scandalous taint would obliterate his rising political prestige within the House of Lords, and sever his lucrative investments with powerful families. His silence was the definitive death sentence for Eleanor's honor. At that precise moment, Viscount Linfield, the esteemed fiancé in whom Eleanor had placed her absolute trust and affection, emerged from the murmuring throng. Instead of moving to shield or cloak the trembling young woman trapped in the center of public humiliation, he looked at her with an expression of supreme, unfiltered contempt, as though he were observing a diseased, filthy insect. With a deliberate, chilling motion, Linfield stripped the brilliant emerald engagement ring from his finger and threw it violently onto the floor, landing mere inches from the toe of Eleanor's silk slipper. The sharp clatter of the gem striking the wood echoed through the silence, marking the absolute, irredeemable shattering of her reputation, her future, and the very last shred of her faith in humanity. A wretched, deceitful harlot smearing the honor of the aristocracy. The betrothal contract between our houses is formally severed this very instant. I will never permit my name to be associated with a thieving wanton. Do not ever dare to cross my path again, Linfield spat, his voice an arctic blast that severed all remaining hope. He pivoted sharply on his heel and immediately strode over to offer his arm to Isabella, who was already wearing a sickening, triumphant smirk, thoroughly intoxicated by her cowardly victory. Cornered, stripped of all dignity, abandoned by her own blood, and publicly humiliated by the man she had trusted, Eleanor stood utterly alone in the vast expanse of Almack's. Not a single gentleman stepped forward to intervene. Not a single lady extended a hand of grace. The pure, unadulterated cruelty of London's high society had been laid bare in its most naked form. That very night, cast out into the freezing winter rain, Eleanor was expelled from the Vance townhouse without a single penny or any portion of her dowry. She had only the thin garments on her back and a heart heavily scarred and bleeding. The biting chill of the London fog whipped against her fragile frame, yet it paled in comparison to the freezing indifference of human nature. Labeled permanently as a socially ruined lady, Eleanor made the resolute decision to abandon her proud aristocratic surname. She adopted the alias Miss Alara, silently vowing to herself that she would never yield and never again place her trust in any member of this hypocritical upper echelon. She would rebuild her life from the ashes, entirely on her own terms. Chapter 2. The iron gates of the Forsaken. The inexpensive, rattling stagecoach jolted violently along the muddy, treacherous dirt roads, venturing deep into the isolated, fog-shrouded highlands of Yorkshire in the north. After 3 grueling days of travel from the opulent yet fundamentally corrupt capital of London, Eleanor finally arrived at her ultimate destination, the Blackwood estate. This vast, forbidding territory was the inviolable domain of the Duke of Blackwood, Arthur Sterling, a living legend who simultaneously served as the ultimate terror of the English aristocracy. He had once been a brilliant military general, amassing countless glorious victories on the continental battlefields. However, a brutal enemy ambush had left him with a horrific, jagged scar that sliced diagonally from the outer corner of his left eye down to his jawline, permanently destroying the flawless, handsome visage of his youth. Following the sudden, tragic death of his former Duchess, in a mysterious carriage accident that occurred on the very night rumors claimed she was fleeing the country with a young lover, the Duke of Blackwood had withdrawn entirely from the social whirl of the Tun. He secluded himself within his colossal stone fortress, earning the chilling moniker, the Feared Duke. Not a single soul dared to encroach upon this gloomy, oppressive land, and terrifying rumors of his violent temper and icy ruthlessness circulated through London's drawing rooms, like ghost stories meant to frighten young debutantes. Eleanor stepped down from the carriage, her freezing, ungloved hands tightly gripping a worn, scuffed leather valise. She was clad in the austere, modest dark gray linen garments characteristic of a common governess. Her brilliant golden hair, once her greatest source of aristocratic pride, was now meticulously hidden beneath a coarse, scratchy bonnet. Looming before her were the massive black iron gates, heavily forged with the imposing falcon crest of the Sterling lineage. Beyond them stood the colossal slate-gray stone manor, piercing the cloudy, gloomy sky like a fortified military stronghold entirely isolated from the rest of humanity. The atmosphere radiated a bone-chilling coldness, profound silence, and an oppressive, suffocating level of discipline. Armed with the meager wages she had acquired from agonizingly selling her mother's pearl necklace, she had responded to an anonymous advertisement for a governess in the Times, desperate to secure a sanctuary as far away from the cruelty of London as possible. A place where the name Eleanor Vance was nothing more than a forgotten disgrace. The head butler, Mr. Higgins, a man, bearing a severe, weathered countenance and an immaculate black livery, devoid of a single wrinkle, received her in the freezing, marble-tiled grand hall. He subjected her to a piercing, experienced appraisal, his eyes scanning her modest attire, before carefully inspecting the forged letter of recommendation she had spent a sleepless night perfectly crafting. "Miss Alara," Mr. Higgins intoned, his deep, frigid voice echoing sharply against the empty stone walls without a single wasted syllable. "Welcome to the Blackwood estate. However, I am compelled to clarify the strict rules beforehand so you may adequately prepare yourself. You are the 7th governess hired within the span of less than a year. The young master, Lord Leo Sterling, is not an ordinary child whom you can easily manage. Ever since the horrific carriage accident that claimed Her Grace's life 2 years ago, the young lord has been afflicted with absolute muteness. He does not utter a single word, frequently succumbs to episodes of absolute terror, violently destroys property, and becomes profoundly aggressive when strangers approach. His Grace is exceedingly occupied with the management of the estate's vast holdings and possesses absolutely no patience for indiscipline. If you cannot bring the boy to heel, you shall be dismissed immediately and thrown out the gates. There is no place for weakness or manufactured tears within this fortress. I understand perfectly, Mr. Higgins. Infinite patience is the one virtue I have never lacked." "Please, lead me to the child," Eleanor replied, her voice composed, tranquil, yet grounded in an unshakable resolve. Her clear, translucent eyes did not betray a single flicker of trembling or hesitation. Having endured the absolute agony of being discarded by her own father and high society, the prospect of facing a silent child or a gloomy, haunted castle was entirely insufficient to make her spine falter. She carried a heart already covered in scars. She did not fear acquiring new ones. Mr. Higgins escorted her down a long, drafty corridor, illuminated only by the flickering glow of hurricane lamps, leading to the secluded library wing in the eastern sector. Just as they approached the heavy oak doors, a sharp, shattering crash echoed from within, signaling the destruction of a precious porcelain artifact, instantly followed by the furious, exasperated shouting of 2 housemaids. "You demonic little brat, you've shattered Her late Grace's antique rose vase again. If His Grace finds out about this, we shall all be thrown out into the streets." A coarse maid advanced, brandishing the handle of a broom, intent on striking the hands of the child who was cowering beneath a massive mahogany reading table. Eleanor immediately strode into the room, her presence projecting such an intense aura of authority and strength that the 2 maids instinctively stumbled backward in shock. She lowered her gaze to the dark shadows beneath the table. There, a small boy of perhaps 6 years old, dangerously thin and possessing a pale face dominated by large, stormy blue eyes that perfectly mirrored a tempest, was curled tightly into a ball. His hands were clamped fiercely over his ears, and his small frame shook violently with absolute terror and panic. His wide eyes filled with extreme defensiveness, resembling a tiny, wounded beast cornered against a wall, fully prepared to bite and tear at anyone who dared reach for him. Instead of employing the iron discipline, threats of the rod, or harsh verbal reprimands that previous, professional governesses had used to assert dominance, Eleanor executed an action that left the servants staring in stunned disbelief. She unfastened her cold, dusty gray cloak and slowly, gracefully sank to her knees upon the expensive Aubusson carpet. She deliberately closed the distance, lowering her eye level until she was perfectly parallel with the frightened child. She did not attempt to forcefully drag him out by his arms, nor did she offer hollow, condescending words of comfort. She simply sat there in perfect silence, retrieving a small piece of charcoal and a blank sheet of paper from her pocket. With swift, soft, and exquisitely precise strokes, she sketched the image of a tiny bird nestled safely within a warm nest, perfectly shielded from a raging storm outside. She gently pushed the paper across the thick carpet, sliding it toward the shadows beneath the table. The profound silence, absolute patience, and the aura of genuine safety that Eleanor projected caused Leo's frantic, ragged breathing to gradually slow. The boy peeked out at the drawing, his innocent curiosity slowly overpowering his dark terror. For the first time in months of being relentlessly forced, dragged, and shouted at, an adult was not attempting to impose violent orders upon him, but was instead silently offering him the purest form of empathy. From the second-floor balcony of the enclosed library, concealed within the deep shadows of the towering, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, Arthur Sterling, the Duke of Blackwood, stood as motionless as a statue carved from black obsidian. He was draped in a dark, impeccably tailored Victorian coat. His high, resolute forehead and the left side of his face were brutally bisected by the sharp, savage scar, a permanent testament to his years of dancing with death on the battlefield. His gaze was icy, as deep and impenetrable as a bottomless abyss, silently observing the entire scene unfolding below. He had witnessed countless women, self-proclaimed brilliant governesses from London, flee in tears from his son's aggressive resistance, or worse, secretly abuse the boy when they believed the Duke was occupied at the registry. But this petite woman, clad in drab, lifeless gray linen, was entirely different. He observed the way she knelt without a shred of hesitation about dirtying her underskirts, the way her spine remained flawlessly straight and proud, even while bowing to the level of a child, and most notably, the way she employed absolute gentleness and infinite patience to breach Leo's locked world. When she finally raised her eyes, shooting a cold, commanding glare that silently ordered the maids out of the room, her clear, unwavering gaze devoid of a single ounce of artifice accidentally collided with Arthur's razor-sharp stare from above. Eleanor flinched slightly upon setting eyes on the notorious Duke. Under the flickering candlelight, the scar on his face appeared terrifyingly savage, yet her eyes did not dart away. They did not register the disgust, the horror, or the manufactured, sickening pity that Arthur constantly endured from every lady of the ton whenever he entered a room. She merely offered a subtle nod of acknowledgement, executing it with the supreme, elegant grace of true nobility, before immediately redirecting her entire focus back to the young boy. The black leather-gloved hand resting on the oak balustrade tightened imperceptibly. Beneath the frigid, impenetrable armor of the ruthlessly disciplined Duke, a tiny, delicate, yet profoundly deep vibration had silently taken root. She did not fear his scar. She was not disgusted by his son's brokenness, a lowly, impoverished governess, yet she carried herself with the unyielding dignity of a queen. Chapter 3. Late dinners and the shattering of stone walls. Eleanor's first week at the Blackwood estate passed in a rhythm of profound silence, oppressive routine, and absolute order. Life within these walls was dictated entirely by the ironclad rules established by the Duke himself following his wife's demise. The long, gloomy corridors were perpetually submerged in a chilling emptiness. There was no laughter, no lavish soirees, only the howling wind whistling through the ancient stained-glass windows. Eleanor devoted the entirety of her time and soul to the nursery in the West Wing, embarking on the arduous journey of unlocking Leo's sealed heart. She quickly discovered that Leo was an exceptionally intelligent child, blessed with a natural genius for drawing and a hypersensitivity to sound. His muteness was not a congenital physical defect, but rather a profound psychological defense mechanism erected to shield him from the overwhelming trauma of the carriage crash that had killed his mother. Rather than forcing the boy to sit at a desk and memorize dry grammar textbooks, or utilizing a wooden ruler to strike his knuckles as the professional governesses had done, Eleanor implemented an entirely revolutionary educational approach. She brought wild weeds and flowers from the estate's untamed gardens into the nursery, teaching him to identify colors by crushing fresh petals to create vibrant watercolors. She sat with him for hours on the sun-drenched window seat, employing sign language and breathtaking sketches to narrate epic tales of valiant knights defending stone fortresses and exploring distant lands. Eleanor's gentleness, unwavering patience, and absolute lack of judgment slowly manifested a tiny miracle amidst the freezing fortress. Leo no longer smashed objects when startled, nor did he crawl under tables in terror at the sound of thunder. The boy began to trail closely behind Eleanor's gray skirts as she walked the gardens, with his small, warm hand gripping her fingers tightly. His stormy blue eyes gradually lit up with sparkling rays of trust and tranquility. Eleanor was no longer merely fulfilling the role of a governess. She was slowly molding into the silhouette of the benevolent mother the boy so desperately craved within his empty soul. According to the strict protocols enforced by the household management, every Friday evening, the head governess was required to personally report on the heir's academic and physical progress to the Duke, either in the main study or his private dining room. These were moments of excruciating tension for any employee, forcing them to directly confront the freezing, terrifying authority of Arthur Sterling. The late dinner was served in a smaller, somewhat warmer dining chamber rather than the cavernous, echoing grand hall. A roaring fire danced violently in the black marble hearth, battling the bone-chilling cold of the Yorkshire Highlands. A massive 3-meter-long oak dining table rigidly divided the two individuals into isolated extremes. Arthur sat at the head of the table, imposing and icy, draped in a sharp black velvet coat tailored in the classic aristocratic style. He poured himself a glass of deep red prestigious Bordeaux wine, without summoning the butler. Eleanor sat at the opposite end, wearing her simple gray dress, her meticulously kept ledger resting on her lap, as she maintained an absolutely flawless posture and a dining etiquette of supreme elegance. Your entries over the past week indicate a marked improvement in controlling Leo's defiant behavior, Arthur intoned, his deep, frigid voice shattering the room's absolute silence. His sharp eyes scanned Eleanor's soft, elegant, flowing cursive in the ledger. However, I signed a contract to bring you here, to teach the boy to speak again, and to master the administrative skills of a nobleman, not to have him rolling in the mud with weeds or drawing meaningless pictures all day. The responsibilities of the Sterling lineage to the realm are impossibly heavy. My heir cannot be permitted to grow into a weak, daydreaming fool. Eleanor slowly raised her head, placing her silver fork softly onto the porcelain plate without making the slightest sound. Her tranquil gaze met the overwhelming, intimidating aura of the Duke directly. She did not bow her head in submission, nor did she tremble with apologies or exhibit the fear so typical of his servants. "Your Grace," Eleanor spoke softly, her clear voice ringing out, carrying an unshakable resolve. "Lord Leo's silence is not a manifestation of weakness. It is an impenetrable fortress built to protect a soul that bears too many bleeding wounds. If you attempt to use the sledgehammer of iron discipline to smash that wall, you will only succeed in collapsing the entire citadel within. To heal a young sapling snapped by a storm, you cannot force it to immediately reach for the sky. You must patiently water its withering roots. Those drawings are not meaningless. They are the only language the boy feels safe enough to trust right now. If you provide him with enough unconditional love and absolute security, his voice will naturally return on its own accord." These sharp, deeply empathetic words, imbued with profound, humane wisdom, left Arthur momentarily stunned. The motion of bringing the wineglass to his lips halted mid-air. For years, everyone surrounding him, from the highest-ranking parliamentarians to the lowest scullery maids, had either attempted to sycophantically flatter him or had mechanically obeyed his ruthless orders out of sheer terror. Never before had anyone dared to look directly into his hideous scar and speak of empathy, of bravely and genuinely healing the wounds of the soul. She was not merely speaking of Leo. It felt as though she were gently pressing her fingers against the invisible, festering scar of betrayal frozen within his own heart. The atmosphere in the dining room became so profoundly silent that one could clearly hear the crackle of dry pine logs in the hearth and the wind whistling against the glass panes. Arthur slowly lowered the wine glass to the marble table without producing a single sound. His piercing gaze drilled into her mind, registering the extraordinary sharpness and profound caution of this young woman. She possessed the conversational grace and the sophisticated subtle irony. The Regency wit of a high-born lady educated at London's most prestigious academies, not that of a governess born of the laboring class. The secret of her true identity lay before him like a thin, tantalizing veil, fiercely stimulating the curiosity and the dormant desire to conquer within the disciplined Duke's mind. You defend your convictions with extraordinary ferocity and without a trace of hesitation, Miss Alara, Arthur murmured, his raspy voice carrying a crushing, overwhelming weight. I expect your method of watering roots will yield tangible results before my patience is entirely exhausted. The Blackwood estate harbors no room for pointless failures or blind pity. With those final words, he stood decisively and strode out of the dining room with a measured, deliberate pace. Yet, as he passed behind Eleanor's chair, he paused for a fraction of a second. The faint, delicate scent of lavender rising from her hair invaded his senses, bringing an inexplicable, profound sense of peace that momentarily banished the lingering scent of gunpowder from his memories. A silent, deep, and unshakable reverence had begun to sprout from those freezing late-night dinners, driving the first significant cracks into the fortress walls, guarding both their hearts. Chapter 4. A tempestuous night and an accidental touch. The brutal Yorkshire winter descended with a vengeance, unleashing blinding, violent blizzards that transformed the Blackwood estate into a completely isolated island amidst an ocean of white. Temperatures plummeted to record lows, and the gale-force winds, screaming through the window, crevices sounded like the howling of starved wolves. On one particular night, a rare, terrifying winter thunderstorm unexpectedly battered the castle. Brilliant, jagged flashes of lightning tore through the pitch-black sky, immediately followed by deafening claps of thunder that violently rattled the fortress's ancient stained-glass windows. The roaring thunder was Leo's most paralyzing phobia, directly mirroring the horrific, structural cracking of the carriage during the accident that killed his mother. In the small bedchamber in the west wing reserved for the heir, Leo curled into a tight, trembling ball in the furthest corner of his massive bed. His hands clamped fiercely over his ears, his entire body shaking violently as his wide eyes overflowed with absolute, unadulterated panic, yet his throat remained incapable of releasing a single cry to alleviate his terror. The sight of a child silently enduring such agonizing psychological torture was enough to shatter the heart of anyone who witnessed it. Eleanor, sleeping in the adjoining chamber, jolted awake the instant the first clap of thunder detonated. She hastily threw on a thin woolen dressing gown and sprinted barefoot into Leo's room, completely disregarding the agonizing, icy bite of the marble floor against her skin. She threw herself onto the bed, enveloping the boy in a desperate embrace, utilizing the entire warmth of her own body to shield his trembling, terrified frame. "It is all right, Leo, I am here, I am right here with you. The thunder cannot harm you. The stone walls of our castle are unyielding. Be a good boy, close your eyes, and listen only to my voice," Eleanor whispered, her tone as soothing and gentle as a serene autumn brook. She rubbed his back with tender rhythmic strokes, softly singing an ancient, calming English lullaby. The pure, crystal-clear timbre of her voice, overflowing with unconditional love, gradually began to pacify Leo's frantic agitation. The boy buried his face into the hollow of her neck, his rapid, ragged breathing slowly stabilizing. His tiny hands clutched the fabric of her dressing gown with an iron grip, refusing to let go, treating her as his sole lifeline amidst the raging tempest. Simultaneously, the heavy oak door to the bedchamber was thrust open with alarming force. Duke Arthur Sterling strode rapidly into the room. His crisp white linen shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, his normally immaculate dark hair was slightly disheveled, and his eyes blazed with the desperate, raw anxiety of a terrified father. He had sprinted through the freezing stone corridors the moment the thunder struck, paralyzed by the fear that his son would slip into another dangerous, catastrophic seizure as he had in the past. But the scene that met his eyes caused his rapid strides to halt abruptly. In the dim, wavering light of the hurricane lamp resting on the nightstand, he saw Eleanor holding Leo securely in her arms upon the vast bed. Her brilliant golden hair cascaded freely over her slender shoulders, her gentle face pressed intimately against his son's forehead, and her sweet lullaby resonated through the freezing expanse of the castle. The tableau was so profoundly beautiful, so sacred, and possessed such a fierce, healing power that Arthur's barren, scarred heart, a heart eternally cloaked in defensive armor, suddenly constricted with a terrifying vulnerability he had buried long ago. He stood paralyzed at the threshold, silently gazing upon the only true salvation this house had known, after years of suffocating darkness and tragedy. Once Leo had surrendered completely to a peaceful, steady sleep, Eleanor carefully lowered him onto the pillows and drew the thick blankets over his chest. But the moment she attempted to stand, the excruciating cold radiating from the stone floor shot through her bare feet, causing her body to sway and lose its balance. Instantly, a solid, fiercely warm arm wrapped securely around her waist. Arthur had closed the distance with the silent, predatory grace of a seasoned general. The potent, masculine scent of cedarwood, mingled with the lingering chill of the blizzard radiating from his broad chest, enveloped the confined space, causing Eleanor's heart to race wildly. "Your Grace," Eleanor stammered, briefly flustered, her breath catching as she instinctively attempted to step back to maintain the rigid, proper boundaries required of a governess. But Arthur did not release her immediately. He reached out and grabbed the thick woolen blanket draped over the armchair, carefully wrapping it around her shivering shoulders to ward off the chill. In the process, his large, rough hand, heavily calloused, and marked by the brutal scars of war, accidentally brushed against Eleanor's slender fingers. In that fleeting second, he acutely felt the tiny, rough calluses on her fingertips, the undeniable marks of scrubbing with freezing water and performing grueling manual labor over the past months. Yet the palm itself and the delicate bone structure of her hand were absolutely soft and exquisitely refined, identical to those of a high-born aristocratic lady, raised in a life of pampered luxury. This perfect, glaring contradiction was an undeniable testament that her true identity was anything but common. His gaze locked onto her translucent eyes, deep, burning with a silent inferno, and bearing a crushing weight that made it impossible for Eleanor to look away. The room was consumed by the sound of the wind screaming outside and the frantic, deafening rhythm of two hearts beating wildly out of control. No saccharine declarations of love were uttered. No desperate, rushed kisses were stolen in the shadows. Within the rigid constraints of Regency society, absolute restraint was the most potent, visceral language of love, slow-burn tension. That accidental touch served as the spark that ignited a profound, exquisite yearning, tightly compressed beneath the ironclad discipline both of them wielded. "Thank you, Alara, for protecting him when I could not," Arthur rasped, every single syllable enunciated with deliberate slowness, his deep voice heavy with an ultimate, profound gratitude. He gently released her, taking a deliberate step back to restore her personal space, but his eyes lingered on her pale, exhausted face a fraction too long before he finally turned and strode out of the room. On that stormy night, the final, impenetrable defensive wall guarding the terrifying Duke's heart crumbled completely, making way for a silent, overwhelming love. Chapter 5. The seeds of jealousy in the first word spring knocked timidly upon the Yorkshire Highlands, bringing with it warm, golden rays of sunlight that melted away the oppressive layers of ice surrounding the Blackwood estate and awakened the tender green shoots from their slumber. Leo's physical and mental health progressed with miraculous speed under Eleanor's devoted, tireless care. Although the boy had not yet spoken, he now smiled radiantly, actively pulling his father by the hand out into the gardens every afternoon to play alongside Eleanor. The stifling, gloomy atmosphere of the isolated fortress was gradually replaced by vibrant strokes of color and the joyful sound of a child's running footsteps. One unusually warm Saturday afternoon, the local physician, Dr. Harrison, a youthful, charming, exceedingly polite, and fiercely enthusiastic young man, arrived at the castle to conduct Leo's routine medical examination. Powerfully captivated by Eleanor's ethereal beauty, her profound knowledge of herbal remedies, and her rare, soothing gentleness, Harrison relentlessly offered sweet, highly suggestive flatteries. He presented her with a vibrant bouquet of wild yellow daffodils, plucked from the moors, passionately debated Renaissance romantic poetry with her, and lingered far too long in the estate's rear gardens simply to converse with her, utterly oblivious to the passing hours. From the stone balcony of the second-floor study, Arthur Sterling stood leaning heavily against the balustrade, his gaze shooting straight down at the scene of the two figures, smiling and chatting, animatedly, beside a cluster of white roses. His sharp, angular face remained as motionless as carved ice, betraying no loud, vulgar display of fury or shouting. Yet his leather-gloved hands gripped the stone railing so fiercely that his knuckles turned stark white. A silent subterranean jealousy, surging like molten lava, violently scorched the proud duke's soul. He felt an agonizing, visceral discomfort witnessing the cheap, eager, and hungry gaze of this insignificant doctor, daring to rest upon the woman he was fiercely desperate to protect at all costs. He abhorred the thought of any other man gazing upon her elegant smile, or listening to the soft, lullaby-like cadence of her voice. Eleanor belonged to the Blackwood estate. She belonged entirely to his world. Unable to suppress the boiling frustration a moment longer, Arthur descended the grand marble staircase, with an aura of absolute, crushing dominance, striding directly into the sunlit garden. His imposing, freezing, and utterly ruthless presence caused Dr. Harrison to snap his mouth shut instantly. The young doctor scrambled awkwardly, bowing deeply in panicked reverence while frantically stepping back. "Dr. Harrison," Arthur stated, his tone as cold and razor-sharp as a drawn saber, cleanly severing the romanticized atmosphere of the spring afternoon. "I trust your medical examination of my son concluded half an hour ago. The road back to the village is long, and the mud remains treacherous. I strongly advise you to depart immediately to ensure the safety of your carriage. Miss Alara's valuable time is strictly dedicated to the education of my heir, not to be squandered on frivolous, empty discussions regarding shallow poetry." The blunt, iron-clad dismissal, dripping with the terrifying authority of the notorious Duke, drained the color completely from the young physician's face. Harrison stammered a clumsy, terrified farewell, and practically bolted for his carriage, never once daring to glance back. Eleanor remained standing amidst the flowers, tilting her head to look up at Arthur. Her expression was a complex mixture of surprise and a deeply hidden, thrilling flutter of the heart at his highly possessive, fiercely protective intervention. She cradled the bouquet of daffodils in her arms, offering him a subtle, refined smile. "Your Grace appears to harbor a rather poor impression of romantic literature," Eleanor noted softly, her voice laced with the delicate, highly sophisticated teasing that defined classic Regency wit. "I heavily favor naked truth and protective action over deceitful, fantastical verses designed solely to manipulate women," Arthur replied, closing the distance between them, effortlessly shattering the boundary of acceptable propriety. His deep, intense gaze swept over her slightly flushed cheeks. With a precise, decisive, yet unbelievably gentle motion, he reached out and brushed away a stray daffodil petal clinging to the shoulder of her dress. "This castle requires your presence, Alara. Do not permit unworthy fools to distract your mind." At that precise moment, Leo burst from the lush green lawns, clutching a drawing he had just completed with wax crayons, eagerly thrusting it toward Eleanor for her approval. The drawing crudely but clearly depicted three figures: a tall man with a scarred face, a woman in a gray dress, and a small child, all holding hands tightly beneath the roof of a large stone house. Perfect whole family. Eleanor dropped to her knees, overwhelmed with profound emotion, and pulled the boy into a fierce, tight embrace as tears of pure joy welled in the corners of her eyes. Enveloped within her warm, safe arms, Leo lifted his stormy blue eyes to gaze directly into Eleanor's face. His tiny lips trembled with intense effort, and then, the very first sound to break a grueling 2-year silence was forced from his throat, clear and bursting with overwhelming emotion: "Mama." That tiny, fragile word detonated like a bomb in the tranquil garden. Arthur's heart suffered a violent, seismic shock. He stumbled back half a step, his eyes wide with absolute, stunning disbelief. The son whom the most renowned physicians in London had condemned to a lifetime of silence had just spoken the word "mama" to an impoverished governess. That miraculous, exquisite healing had permanently forged the destinies of these three individuals together into a true, undeniable found family. No employment contract, no rigid societal boundary, and no class prejudice could ever tear them apart again. Chapter 6. The estate dinner and the enemy's return. The London season was rapidly approaching, and bound by his strict political obligations as a nobleman, controlling the nation's most vital coal reserves, the Duke of Blackwood was compelled to open the doors of his fortress to host a magnificent estate dinner. The event was mandated to entertain influential senators, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, and the most powerful aristocratic families within the government. The gloomy stone castle was brilliantly transformed, illuminated by thousands of beeswax candles, carpeted with lush red roses, and echoing with the music of the finest chamber orchestra summoned directly from the capital. Eleanor, strictly adhering to her station as head governess, was strictly forbidden from appearing at the main banquet table. Instead, she stood observing from the high, shadowed balcony of the upper gallery, silently ensuring the servants executed the meal service with flawless royal etiquette. Among the luxurious carriages rolling through the estate gates was one bearing the crest of the Earl of Vance. In a cruel twist of fate, driven by a desperate need to lobby for a coveted seat in the House of Lords, Eleanor's biological father had utilized every conceivable bribe and underhanded tactic to secure an invitation to the Duke of Blackwood's table. Accompanying him, inevitably, was the fiercely ambitious Dowager Lady Vance, her perpetually scheming and silk-draped daughter Isabella, and Viscount Linfield, the cowardly traitor who was now Isabella's betrothed. They swept into the resplendent grand hall, suffocating arrogance, flaunting their manufactured wealth while aggressively seeking every opportunity to flatter and ingratiate themselves with the powerful Duke in pursuit of political ascension. While the banquet proceeded flawlessly, and the guests were deeply engrossed in savoring the exquisite vintage wines, Lady Vance accidentally cast her gaze upward toward the second-floor gallery. Her venomous eyes instantly locked onto the slender silhouette and the unmistakably beautiful, familiar face of the woman standing in the shadows, despite her deliberate attempt to conceal herself in a plain, drab gown. She froze in sheer disbelief for a few seconds before a wicked, malevolent smirk stretched across her rouged lips. A magnificent, golden opportunity to permanently eradicate her stepdaughter, whilst simultaneously earning immense favor by protecting the Duke's spotless reputation, had essentially been handed to her on a silver platter. Lady Vance hastily whispered her toxic discovery to Viscount Linfield and Isabella. They exchanged conspiratorial, knowing glances and instantly orchestrated a despicable, theatrical scene right in the center of the dignified dining hall. She deliberately took a dramatic step backward, violently colliding with a footman carrying a silver tray of wine, sending dozens of priceless crystal goblets crashing to the floor. The deafening, chaotic noise caused the orchestra to halt immediately, drawing the shocked attention of every single guest directly to her. Heavens, I simply cannot believe my own eyes. Lady Vance shrieked, covering her mouth in exaggerated horror while pointing a trembling finger directly at the balcony where Eleanor stood frozen. Your Grace, Duke of Blackwood. I beg you, guard yourself. Why on earth are you harboring a convicted fraud, a wretched, despicable harlot bearing the most ruined, filthy reputation in all of London within your pure, honorable castle? The atmosphere in the banquet hall instantly froze into solid ice. Arthur Sterling, who had been deep in conversation with the foreign minister, narrowed his eyes sharply as a freezing, lethal aura began to blaze in the depths of his gaze. He pivoted on his heel and strode to the very center of the hall. His deep, icy, and absolutely commanding voice boomed, instantly slicing through the rising murmurs of the crowd. Lady Vance, you are openly hurling vile insults at the head governess of the Blackwood estate, the very woman directly entrusted with the care and protection of my heir. They see few possess concrete, undeniable proof to back these wild, unhinged accusations. Otherwise, the entire House of Vance shall pay a devastating price before the law for the crime of slandering the Sterling lineage. Proof? Every single honorable aristocrat present in this room can testify to the absolute truth of my words. Lady Vance sneered, stepping forward arrogantly, entirely intoxicated by her cheap, self-serving theatrics. She turned to the crowd, loudly exposing her target with the explicit intent to destroy. That woman parading under a false identity is none other than Eleanor Vance, the disgraced, disowned daughter expelled from our very family. She committed the heinous crime of stealing ancestral heirlooms, engaged in illicit, filthy affairs with low-born laborers, and had her betrothal formally annulled, resulting in her permanent expulsion from high society, ruined lady, barely a year ago. Your Grace, you are a great and noble man. You have been utterly deceived by her fake, innocent facade. How can such a filthy, contaminated wretch be permitted to lay a finger upon the noble heir of the Sterling line? You must throw her out into the streets immediately. Hand her over to us so we may drag her back to London to face justice. Viscount Linfield eagerly chimed in, flashing a look of supreme, unadulterated disgust up at the balcony. a pathetic, promiscuous woman. It is an absolute insult to the face of the ton that she dared to cross the threshold of this sacred estate. A wave of malicious, criticizing whispers erupted across the dining hall. The noblewomen hid their cruel sneers behind their fans, while the gentlemen muttered harsh judgments regarding the governess's disgraceful origins. They collectively cornered Eleanor, firmly convinced that given the feared Duke's notorious obsession with discipline, his icy ruthlessness, and his documented hatred of betrayal, he would instantly command his guards to hurl this scandalous woman out the doors to preserve the spotless honor of his house. They waited with eager, malicious anticipation to watch Eleanor fall to her knees and beg for mercy in absolute humiliation. High up on the balcony, Eleanor stood petrified, her face drained of all color, as pale as a sheet of parchment. The horrific nightmare of Almack's rushed back with a vengeance, suffocating her heart. Her trembling hands gripped the cold stone railing so tightly, her knuckles ached, unable to force a single sound of defense from her throat against the relentless barrage. Her eyes burned red with unshed tears, her fingers desperately twisting the fabric of her gray skirt. The excruciating humiliation of having her ruined past dragged into the light before the very man to whom she had secretly surrendered. Her entire heart made her feel as though she were plummeting into a bottomless abyss. For the second time in her life, she was being publicly butchered for the cruel amusement of the ton. Yet, in the very center of the brilliantly lit hall, Arthur Sterling did not exhibit a single trace of anger toward Eleanor. His eyes held not a single flicker of disgust or disappointment. He looked up at the balcony, absorbing the trembling, isolated, and profoundly desperate silhouette of the woman he loved. His hands curled into tight, lethal fists. The true, terrifying wrath of the most feared duke in England finally detonated, but it was absolutely not directed at the fragile governess. Chapter 7. The legal might of the feared Duke, a terrifying, deathly silence smothered the entire banquet hall as Duke Arthur Sterling slowly, deliberately ascended the marble stairs to the second-floor gallery. Each heavy, resolute footstep struck the marble like the beat of an executioner's drum, signaling the absolute annihilation of the House of Vance. The audience held its collective breath, bracing for the hurricane. The Dowager Lady Vance and her arrogant cohort smiled smugly, fully believing the Duke was personally going to drag the criminal down by her neck and throw her into the mud to wash away the stain on his honor. Upon reaching Eleanor, Arthur did not shout a single reprimand, nor did he order his guards to seize her. Instead, before the shocked, bulging eyes of hundreds of members of the ton, he reached up and unclasped the heavy, imposing black velvet cloak from his own shoulders, woven with the silver thread of the sterling crest and, with exquisite, profound reverence, draped it securely over Eleanor's violently trembling shoulders. His intense body heat and the strong, reassuring scent of cedarwood instantly enveloped her, forming an impenetrable shield against the vicious, predatory glares below. That single gesture was an absolute declaration of total protection. It was a brutal, direct slap across the face of every individual who had just dared to judge her. He gently grasped her freezing, trembling hand, and with unshakable resolve, led her down the grand staircase, walking her directly into the very center of the resplendent dining hall. The entire room was so profoundly stunned that no one could utter a single syllable. Linfield's jaw dropped in sheer disbelief. The triumphant smirk on Lady Vance's face froze into a mask of horror. Arthur halted in the center of the room, his gaze as frigid as Arctic ice piercing straight through the villains. He gave a sharp, commanding wave of his hand from the shadows of the room. Mr. Finch, the supreme head solicitor of the Sterling estate, the mastermind who managed the kingdom's most sensitive intelligence networks and legal contracts, stepped forward with deep reverence, carrying a sleek black leather briefcase. Lady Vance, Arthur's voice resonated, steady, slow, yet carrying the lethal, slicing power of a straight razor. Did you genuinely believe that my silence in this isolated castle equated to ignorance of the filthy, conniving plots executed in the capital? From the very first night Miss Alara set foot upon my lands, my Royal Intelligence Network has been conducting a ruthless, exhaustive investigation into the absolute roots of her past. Arthur jerked his chin. Mr. Finch immediately withdrew a massive, thick dossier from the leather case, sealed with the heavy red wax of the High Court, and slammed it violently onto the banquet table, directly in front of the Vance family. "Open your eyes wide and look upon your own filthy evidence," Arthur commanded, his voice cracking like a whip. Those forged love letters were penned by a professional forger, whom you personally paid to replicate Eleanor's handwriting. The entirety of the ancestral emerald parure was never stolen. It was secretly pawned by your own hand, at the underground gambling dens on the outskirts of London to liquidate the massive, humiliating debts accrued by your daughter, Isabella's gambling addiction. Furthermore, you explicitly bribed the stable boy with heavy banknotes to fabricate the entire slanderous tale, purposefully designed to strip Eleanor of her legal inheritance and her massive dowry, clearing the path for Isabella to crawl into the bed of that cowardly Viscount Linfield. The Duke's ironclad declaration slammed into the hall like a devastating artillery shell. Every piece of evidence, from the pawnshop receipts and the bribery bank drafts to the fully signed and notarized confession of the stable boy, was laid out with crystal-clear transparency, bearing the undeniable, authoritative signatures of the royal magistrates. The absolute truth of the matter had been laid bare in its most naked, brutal form. The very people who had trampled upon Eleanor were, in reality, a pack of greedy, despicable, and highly professional frauds and demons. Lady Vance's face turned the color of ash. She stumbled backward, her entire body shaking uncontrollably, her mouth opening and closing without producing a sound. The Earl of Vance was so paralyzed by terror that his legs gave out entirely, collapsing into a pathetic heap on the stone floor. Viscount Linfield frantically scrambled away from Isabella, as if she were carrying the plague, desperately attempting to sever all ties with the fraudulent family to salvage his own personal honor. But the contemptuous glares of the surrounding senators had already pinned him to the wall as a willing accomplice. The utter annihilation of a powerful aristocratic family occurred in the blink of an eye against the supreme, unstoppable force of the truth. Eleanor stood frozen beside Arthur, the tears she had violently repressed for so long finally slipping down her cheeks. They were no longer tears of burning humiliation, but tears of absolute, profound liberation. The agonizing injustice she had endured for so many dark months was finally washed away by the power, the intellect, and the absolute unyielding protection of the greatest man in the realm. Chapter 8. The historic reversal and the viral quote. The aristocratic members of the ton present at the banquet instantly executed a breathtakingly hypocritical reversal of attitude. Those same individuals, who only minutes prior had eagerly joined the mob in humiliating Eleanor, now collectively hissed, pointing fingers and hurling the most venomous, degrading insults at the Vance family. They hastily backed away, treating Lady Vance and her daughter like lepers. The absolute falsehood and the sickening, blow-with-the-wind nature of the upper class had never been displayed so vividly. They foolishly assumed the Duke merely wished to clarify the truth to protect his employees' innocence and thereby preserve his estate's spotless dignity. Lady Vance, consumed by the frantic, manic desperation of watching her entire lineage crumble into dust, shrieked her final, pathetic defense in a desperate bid to salvage a shred of face. "Your Grace, even if I am entirely at fault, even if I fabricated the tale, Eleanor Vance's reputation has already been completely annihilated across the front pages of every broadsheet in London. She was cast out of the aristocracy. She is a homeless vagabond forced into a life of servitude. A woman bearing such a ruined reputation, ruined lady, can never, ever hold her head high in London society again. Do you genuinely intend to harbor a creature devoid of honor? The Blackwood Castle will be permanently stained." A terrifying, suffocating silence gripped the hall. Arthur Sterling slowly, deliberately turned to face her. He did not strike her, he did not draw a sword to punish the lowborn. He simply reached out and gently wrapped his arm tightly around Eleanor's slender waist, pulling her flush against his solid, fiercely warm chest, completely disregarding the hundreds of burning eyes fixed upon them. His eyes blazed with an untamed, razor-sharp pride that swept across the breathless crowd. And with a deep, resonant voice that carried the absolute, unchallengeable authority of a reigning monarch delivering judgment, he unleashed the ultimate, crushing blow that shattered the rotten ideological foundation of the ton. Her honor is not dictated by the tongues of absolute scum. From this moment forth, her honor is Blackwood. That explosive, viral declaration, viral protective quote, sent a massive shockwave through the entire banquet hall, instantly obliterating every doubt and shattering the rigid, suffocating class boundaries of Regency society. The most powerful duke in England had publicly, irrevocably declared his choice. He had not merely cleared her name, He had elevated her to the absolute pinnacle of the social hierarchy, placing her as an equal beside his own sovereign power. Eleanor gazed up at the sharp, resolute lines of Arthur's profile, her heart overflowing with a fierce, passionate love surging like a tempest. She was no longer a lowly governess. She was no longer a discarded, ruined lady. She was the sole, undeniable choice of the Duke of Blackwood. Immediately following his declaration, under the direct supervision of the highest legal officials present, Arthur commanded Mr. Finch to execute the financial sentencing. The entirety of the Vance family's estate deeds, their London townhouse, and every single bank draft were formally seized and legally transferred into the sole possession of Eleanor Vance as full compensation for her stolen dowry and the severe emotional torment she had been forced to endure. The Vance family was officially rendered penniless, utterly bankrupted. They were immediately seized by the royal guards, violently expelled from the banquet hall, and thrown out into the freezing, punishing rain. They were reduced to homeless vagabonds, permanently boycotted by high society, and blacklisted for eternity from every social registry. The crowd witnessed this brutal, total, and overwhelmingly satisfying retribution, revenge dopamine, in stunned silence. Not a single soul dared utter half a syllable of pity. Viscount Linfield attempted to step forward, wearing a sickening, sycophantic smile, in a pathetic attempt to salvage his dignity and beg Eleanor for forgiveness, hoping to rekindle their past alliance. He received nothing but a glare as sharp as a butcher's blade from Arthur. Terrified to his very core, Linfield automatically stumbled backward and practically sprinted out of the castle in absolute, crushing disgrace. The reversal of status, public status reversal, had been executed flawlessly, becoming the most shocking, historic event of the London season. Chapter 9. The prerogative of a duchess. The banquet concluded in an atmosphere of absolute, reverent submission from every guest in attendance. The very noblewomen who had previously hurled mocking insults now formed a long line, executing deeply respectful curtsies to Eleanor, addressing her with the heavy solemn title, Your Grace, with palpable awe and fear. They had instantly realized that the woman standing beside the Duke of Blackwood did not merely possess exquisite beauty, but harbored an extraordinary inner strength, and enjoyed the inviolable protection of the most powerful man in the kingdom. The Blackwood Castle had finally, undeniably found its true mistress, instantly silencing all gossip. When the final carriages rolled out of the estate gates, carrying with them awed whispers of the Duke's brilliant justice, the atmosphere within the castle returned to its familiar, peaceful tranquility. In the grand library, illuminated by the roaring fire, Arthur and Eleanor stood facing one another beside the marble hearth. Between them, the impenetrable wall of class distinction had vanished. The restrictive governess contract was nothing but ashes. All that remained was the profound, genuine vibration of two heavily scarred souls who had miraculously found one another in the midst of a violent storm. I owe you a profound apology, Eleanor, Arthur spoke, his deep voice rich with emotion, his dark eyes sweeping over her face as he completely stripped away his armor of icy indifference. I concealed the truth of my investigation from you for many agonizing months. I needed to gather every single piece of razor-sharp legal evidence to ensure that no rat could use a silver tongue to escape justice. I wanted to hand you a complete, flawless vengeance, and the absolute, unquestionable restoration of your honor before the entirety of the realm. Eleanor smiled, her translucent eyes overflowing with absolute understanding and boundless grace. She stepped forward, proactively reaching up to trace the jagged scar on his left cheek, the very scar that terrified the rest of the world, but which, to her, was the ultimate symbol of supreme bravery and noble sacrifice. You owe me no apologies whatsoever, Arthur. You gave me the most precious gift a person can offer. Absolute unquestioning trust, when the entire world had turned its back on me. You provided me with a safe haven, a child to pour my love into, and the power to stand up on my own 2 feet. She looked deeply into his eyes, her voice unshakable and infinitely tender. I do not love you for your ducal title, or the impenetrable protection you offer. I love you because you are the only man who looked past the drab gray dress of a ruined governess, and truly saw my heart. Arthur's large, rough hand covered her small fingers resting against his cheek. He pulled her flush against him and bowed his head, claiming her lips in a profound, passionate, and fiercely consuming kiss, a kiss that held all the desperate restraint, the burning desire, and the explosive love that had been agonizingly compressed over months of internal conflict. Slow burn payoff. That kiss obliterated every trace of past agony, marking a brilliant, triumphant, and perfect new beginning for the Blackwood fortress. Chapter 10. Dawn at the Blackwood Estate. By the following summer, the Blackwood Estate was bathed in brilliant, golden sunlight, its vast gardens overflowing with carpets of immaculate white blooming roses. The wedding of the Duke and Duchess of Blackwood was conducted with solemn dignity in the castle's private stone chapel. It was devoid of the loud, ostentatious extravagance of London, yet it brimmed with profound sanctity and intimate warmth. Eleanor, draped in a breathtaking gown of hand-woven white silk and crowned with an exquisite pearl tiara, walked radiantly down the aisle amidst the reverent admiration of the entire household staff and their true, loyal friends. There was no trace of the Ton's suffocating hypocrisy here, only absolute, unadulterated sincerity. Young Leo, who had blossomed into a lively, robust child with a perpetually radiant, innocent smile, wore a miniature tailcoat. He beamed with immense pride as he carried the red velvet cushion, bearing the wedding bands to the altar. The boy looked up at Arthur and Eleanor, his eyes sparkling with boundless joy. His small, broken family was finally perfectly whole. Eleanor's presence had genuinely and completely healed the child's traumatized soul, transforming him into an heir filled with love and confidence, fully prepared to shoulder the future of his great lineage. Life at Blackwood Castle entered a brilliant, unprecedented era of immense prosperity. Under the brilliant administrative intellect and the compassionate, just hand of Duchess Eleanor, the laborers' cottages were extensively renovated. Schools were established for the children of the estate, and highly lucrative commercial contracts brought staggering wealth to the Sterling family. She was not merely a beautiful ornament standing silently beside the Duke at banquets. She was a true, formidable partner, a powerful mistress who wielded real authority and earned the profound respect of thousands. Meanwhile, in the squalid, mud-choked alleys on the darkest fringes of London, the Vance family dragged out a pathetic existence mired in deep humiliation, starvation, and the absolute total shunning of society. The Dowager and Isabella bickered incessantly, viciously blaming one another for the total collapse of their house, permanently buried in the dark abyss of their well-deserved punishment. They had paid the ultimate catastrophic price for their insatiable greed and bottomless cruelty. A tranquil afternoon cast a soft golden glow over the crystal-clear lake behind the castle. Arthur Sterling sat reading in an oak armchair on the balcony, his arms securely wrapped around Eleanor's waist as she smiled, resting her head comfortably against his broad shoulder. They watched the tiny silhouette of Leo sprinting joyfully across the sun-drenched lawn, chasing the estate's sheepdog. The sweet fragrance of white roses mingled with the evening breeze, delivering a sensation of absolute perfect peace. Arthur pressed a soft, lingering kiss to his wife's golden hair, his eyes blazing with the profound serenity he once believed he had lost forever on the brutal battlefields. The notorious feared and scarred Duke had finally discovered his ultimate sanctuary, beside the ruined governess who had possessed the courage to reignite the light within his dark, freezing fortress. True lasting glory was not found in the dazzling, deceit-filled ballrooms of London, but in the unshakable, steadfast, and absolutely loyal love that now thrived within the stone walls of Blackwood. A true dynasty of love and salvation had officially begun.